So welcome to week 4. Parental guidance suggested we're going to talk a little bit about squash sex tonight. So this is going to be our first of 2 forays into hand pollination, because squash is one of the most amenable to the hand pollination process. And it's also one that can benefit the most of it, depending on how you're setting up your trial. So more on that in just a bit, but we're going to cover today primarily 4 crops: squash, the entire species of Cucurbita, summer, winter, everything in between, cucumbers, melons, and watermelons, which are also the same genus and species as citron melons. I've not grown citron before, but I put this on here to just alert folks that if you are growing citron and watermelon, even though they're different from one another, mechanically they are related and they will cross. So we're going to focus mostly on watermelons for the last portion of today. So let's dive right in. Here we are with squash. Squash lends itself to a lot of misnomers because we have pumpkins. All pumpkins are squash. Not all squash are pumpkins. Not all pumpkins are the same species. Some pumpkins are really compatible with each other. There's summer squash, there's winter squash. So we're going to sort all this out. There are 4 main species of squash that you see in front of you. There's Cucurbita pepo, Cucurbita moschata, Cucurbita maxima, and Cucurbita argyrosperma, formerly Cucurbita mixta. In the unlikely and rare event of an interspecific cross, meaning 2 different species crossing with one another, you either have an exciting new endeavor with something that no one's seen before, or more likely, you have something that is close to, if not entirely, sterile. So, unless it's a super precious project, you can grow all 4 of these side by side by side by side and not worry at all about them crossing. So most of the summer squash that people eat, almost all of it, with some exceptions, thinking of like the cucuzi and a few others, fall in the Cucurbita pepo variety. So this is yellow crookneck, this is zephyr zucchini, this is green zucchini, costata romanesca. It's also some winter squashes too, like delicata. I think another one would be sweet dumpling, I think is also one, and others of that permutation. And then most pumpkin varieties, in terms of just what you think of as on autumnal orange harvests carving pumpkin. So those are basically all the Cucurbita pepo. With summer squashes, we'll get into in a second. That is something that you eat at a different stage than when it is ready for seed. All the other ones, winter squash, pumpkins, and so forth, we're going to get into in a second. You eat those when they are botanically mature. Cucurbita moschata is the butternut group. So that's most famously butternut squash. It's also some pumpkins like cheese pumpkin, black futsu, which is a Japanese small or ribbed pumpkin, wonderful chestnutty pumpkin that's become more and more in fashion in the States these days. Musqué de Provence, or fairy tale pumpkin, which is what you think of with Cinderella carriage, very big, heavily ribbed. So we do have some pumpkins in this category, but they're pumpkins that do not look like standard autumn harvests carving pumpkins. And then golden cushaw. There are a few different types of cushaw squash. All of them, as you can see below, are in the Cucurbita argyrosperma, except for golden cushaw, that sometimes is labeled orange cushaw, but is not orange striped cushaw, to my knowledge. That is variation on the green striped cushaw. Cucurbita maxima is the Hubbard group. All banana squashes. Think of ones that have sort of really hard rinds, like a Hubbard. Usually drier flesh, tend to be very on the melony side, not always, but often. Buttercups as well. And then the argyrosperma, excuse me. So almost all gourds fall into this argyrosperma category, which is hard for me to say, as you can tell. If you're growing ornamental gourds, there are some gourds that are actually old pepo varieties or Cucurbita pepo varieties. So if you're thinking about growing gourds side by side with other crops and harvesting all for seed, that's wonderful. I encourage you to do it, but just check the species before you do so. So squash is an annual. It is originally a tropical plant that we are fortunate enough, after thousands of years of adaptation by first peoples, to grow it in this area. It has traveled across the pond and back in new iterations. We wrote wet / dry seed type because The seed is technically a wet seeded because it's inside a cavern that does contain moisture, but unlike the tomatoes that we were discussing previously, it doesn't have, in the case of squash, that sort of gelatinous sac that you need to break down or ferment. So the seed does have some natural resistance to sprouting inside, but some who may have kept pumpkins until the following July may also have found sprouted seeds on the inside. So we treat this basically like a dry seeded crop when it comes to harvest time. I'm going to introduce a new term here for flower type. So there are two sort of categories of flower types that we haven't gotten into yet, because with other self-pollinators, it's not as relevant. But a monoecious flower, monoecious is Latin meaning something to the tune of one household. So that basically means that all the requisite flowers and or parts are on the same plant. So that means that one squash plant has two types of flowers on it, but one squash plant is capable of producing seed. Squash's main MO is insects of all types, bumblebees as well, lots of different types of bees. There's actually a native bee that's called a squash bee, which is a specialist for squash that looks like a smaller bumblebee. And if you're lucky enough to have them around, then you will have wonderful pollination in your patch. The other pollination mechanism is you, hopefully. So check with your neighbors if you're in community gardens or you have a garden or a farm in proximity, because insects can travel and squash pollen travels with them, because bumbles and other bees are especially attracted to squash pollen and the nectar inside the flowers. So we have 800 feet as an absolute minimum. That would be, you know, if you have a wood break or some sort of contours, or the prevailing wind goes the other way, or you just don't have a lot of pollinators around. If you're in you know, in the case of an urban environment or something like that, you can probably get away with the lower side. General isolation distance, I think commercially, is at least a half a mile. We've put up to a mile because bees travel. And so if you have a lot of people growing squash, you're growing a pumpkin, somebody's growing a summer squash, you don't want a pumpkin that looks like crookneck. So for viable seed, one squash will produce viable seed on its own. But again, depending on the space that you have and your ambition, which hopefully is great, the more the merrier. So we recommend at least 25 plants for long-term genetic maintenance. Now, this does not say that you need to grow 25 squash plants if you're a gardener in order to keep a squash going. You can grow one plant, you can grow 3 plants, you can grow 5 plants. Just think in the long term, you eventually want to either swap some seeds with a friend who's growing the same thing and mix those seeds together so you have more diversity in that way, or reintroduce seeds from a seed company or something of the similar variety, just to make sure that you can keep the genetic composition as diverse as possible for the long term. And you can avoid a bottleneck where a squash is so inbred that it doesn't adapt and you can't select for things like disease or insect resistance. So here we have 2 different types of squash flowers. In the bottom right corner, you can see there is a male or a pollen-bearing flower. It's skinny, it's a long, kind of nice-looking flower just about to open. Above, you can see flowers that are just finishing off with little bumps. Those are the ovaries. Those are your female or ovarian flowers. And so the key, whether the bees or you are doing it, is to transfer flowers either on the same plant or across plants, depending on your breeding goals, which we can talk a little bit about, from the bottom right to the top left. Also, the bottom left is also an ovary or an ovarian flower. You can see inside, there's sort of some stickiness in there. It's basically waiting to be, to receive pollen. And there's a bee happily taking a nap in there. She looks very content. Now back to the basics. This is what you do for hand pollination. Starts the night before. So you go out and you look for the pollen-bearing flowers, which again, bottom right corner, no bump on the bottom. And they're looking in this stage. So you can see that the calyxes on the bottom of the flower are starting to disconnect from the petals, but the flower is not opened yet. It's still green on the bottom, but it's blushed on the top. It's got some orange-yellow coloring to it. This is a flower that will open tomorrow. So you pluck those from the desired plant. And we'll get into ways to transfer pollen and what that all means. But first, just the basics. So you go find those skinny flowers with no bumps, and you pluck them the night before, and you bring them inside in a safe place. At the same time that you're going out the evening before, you want to find female or ovarian flowers that do not look like the ones in the top right and top left. Those are ones that have already blossomed. You can see the flower is starting to rot. Squash blossoms are only viable for one day and usually have received all the pollen they need to pollinate by mid-morning. So make sure you have a strong cup of coffee or tea or beverage of choice in the morning to help you get up and race the bumblebees to this flower. So these flowers that you see on the top, pretend that they are looking like the bottom right flower, nice and closed up, but blushed with color, except they have a bump on the bottom. And these flowers, you want to put a bag over. This can be the organza blossom bags, those fine mesh bags for weddings and stuff that we've talked about before. This could be a paper bag. This could be a plastic bag, although I don't recommend using plastic because morning moisture can tend to rot flowers. So ideally you want to use paper or one of these organza bags. You can also use tape if you don't want to put a bag over this female flower, ovarian flower. You can use a piece of medical tape or a paper clip or a clothespin. You can get creative depending on what you have around. The problem with using the latter, the clothespin or the medical tape, is that you're going to tear the flower once you end up taking this off the next day or do some damage to it. So you have to make sure if you're not using a bag and you're using a device of some sort, that you're putting it up on the top of the flower tip as high onto the petals as possible so that tomorrow in the morning, you can go out and remove it and still have enough material to be able to close the flower up afterwards. The other problem with not using a bag is that bumblebees can chew through flowers. I have seen it. If they really want what's inside there, they can make a little hole right through the petal. So again, if you're doing a lot of flowers and you don't have a lot of bags, or there's concern or it's going to rain the next day and you don't want to have a lot of moisture on your flower, you can try other things like clothespins or medical tape. But my recommendation is to stick with a bag because it's very easy to just take off the next day, do your thing. And so what's the thing that you're doing? In the morning, before you go outside, take your hot beverage of choice and go to your stack of pollen flowers, these bottom right corner, skinny flowers, and gently peel off the petals until what you have in your hand resembles a paintbrush. It will be the anthers and a long filament connected to the calyx. So you'll have this wonderful little spongy paintbrush, and you'll take that outside and you'll take your bag off. And by this time, the flower will be opening on the ovary flower, on the female flower. And if it's not fully open, that's okay. You can just gently tease the petals open, and you take your little paintbrush and you swab around the inside of the bottom left here, hopefully not disturbing a bumblebee that might have snuck in. And that's it, folks. After that, you put the bag back on, put some flagging tape on, something bright that you can notice. And once that flower falls off, the next day, you can take the bag off, and you will know for sure that that squash that develops into maturity will have the pollen that you want in it. So what is the pollen that you want in it? There are a couple different ways to approach hand pollination based on what the goals are. If you're trying to breed a new variety of squash, which is wonderful. If you're trying to preserve an existing squash variety and you have concerns about, let's say, growing two types of Cucurbitaceae and you want to keep them separate, this is another way to do that. Or if you have one standout, absolutely wonderful squash in your patch, and you want to make sure that you're getting all the pollen from that one squash plant into the squash itself and not having cross-pollination. So all of these are different goals, and all can lean into hand pollination as a mechanism to achieve these goals. And if you are focusing on just maintaining a really good variety, and you're not focusing on either pollinating one particular plant that's a standout or several plants that are a standout that you would recombine the seed later, or you're not starting a new breeding project, it's really important to take multiple flowers and use a little bit of each paintbrush on each flower. Instead of taking one paintbrush and transferring the pollen from that one flower to multiple ovaries, you want to do kind of the reverse. You want to take as many males as possible. And you want to bring those and use a little pollen on each one of the females, because that'll ensure that you're maximizing the diversity that's within that squash and not just taking one. So generally speaking, if you're doing preservation, that's the way to do it. Take multiple flowers and do this multiple times over the year. You'll know within, I would say 72 hours or so, if that pollen took. And the reason squash hand pollination is so wonderful, aside from just, squash love in general, is because it's very easy to do, and there's a very high rate of the pollen taking. So it's very straightforward. There's not a lot of delicate parts that you're manipulating to really get in and get the pollen to where it needs to go. It's very forgiving. And if for some reason, which is highly unlikely, but for some reason the pollen didn't take inside your cross or inside your hand pollination, that ovary will just sort of wither and die, which you might have seen sometimes when it's really, really hot, like in a greenhouse especially, and a summer squash is growing, and you see that little bump start to expand, and then the thing just turns brown and dies. That's because usually the pollen wasn't viable because it was so hot, or for any number of reasons like that. So it's good to do it multiple times, but keep an eye on that. And after that first day, you can take the bag off of the female flower, because it will no longer receive pollen from others. It's done its thing. The flowers are falling, the petals are falling off. The pollen is transferred down the style and into the ovary, and you're good. Selfing is what we refer to when we're taking pollen from the same plant and we're transferring it from your paintbrush to your little ovary bump. Sibbing is you're taking pollen flowers from the same species, from the same variety, and you're moving them across plants. So like a sibling, you're sibbing by moving some of that genetics, some of that pollen from plant to plant to plant. There's no wrong way to approach this. It's really, again, based on whether you want to grow a number of squash from the same species and keep them isolated and pure. This is the way to do it if you want to create a new breeding project and make sure that your project took, or if you want to continue to select the best of the best beyond just what we call mass selection, meaning going out, harvesting the best squash. It's an important reminder here that it's very easy to look at your squash harvest at the end of the year when you're eating it in fall and winter and say, this is a beautiful squash. I'm going to save seed from this squash. Obviously, the fruit itself, the squash itself, is super important because that's what we're eating. We want it to store well. We want it to taste good. We want it to look beautiful. But we also want to see the plant that it came from, because it is, not uncommon that a really nice looking squash can come from an okay plant. And so that's a breeding project in itself, is saying, let's take the really healthy squash and cross them all to themselves, or cross them amongst each other and save seed from those separately. So there are all types of ways to go about this. If you have particular breeding goals or preservation goals around hand pollination, just give us a shout and we can share with you how we would approach that. So for harvest, if you're harvesting squash from a summer squash variety, it's important to remember that the eating stage is not the same as the botanically mature stage. So if you harvest a zucchini when you would want to eat it, you will not have viable seed. Similar to what we were talking about in previous classes, when this is mature, you know it because the color changes and the skin hardens. So it looks like something different. I think we were referencing this with eggplant. So you want to wait till there's kind of a harder shell and the young sheen of a zucchini or a summer squash is gone. And, you can basically stick your thumbnail into it and it doesn't bruise in the same way that a young summer squash would bruise. That's when you know it's botanically mature. Winter squash, just harvest it as you would for eating. Both with summer and winter squash, we recommend about 20 days of curing off the vine, because that just gives the squash themselves some extra time to finish maturing and produce more seed ideally. So curing can be putting in a sunny window. It can be putting in a greenhouse like you see here. It can be in just a warm environment for a week or two to pull all the residual moisture that's left in it and prepare it for storage so it will store better. And then processing and storage is really easy. Scoop them, rinse them, put them on a plate or a sheet pan, and you're done. You'll know they're dry enough when, like with other seeds we've talked about, you can take one of the squash seeds and it snaps in your hand instead of bends. That's when you know it's ready to be put away for storage. So now we're going to move on to cucumbers. I should mention that the other three in the cucurbit family that we're going to talk about, there are greater challenges to hand pollination First and foremost, because the flowers are just smaller and more delicate, and plucking them is a little more nuanced, but also because we're introducing another term here, which is andromonoecious, which means this is based on my experience and what I've read, and others can chime in too. But andromonoecious means that instead of having separate male, separate female, or separate pollen, separate ovarian flowers on the same plant, you have perfect flowers as the female, and then you also have male flowers as well. So you have flowers that are capable of selfing themselves, and you also have flowers that just have pollen, but you don't just have female flowers in the case of that. We'll see this a lot more with melons, and it really is trial and error. It's a matter of getting down on your hands and knees and taking a look at what's going on. Sometimes they are monoecious. Oftentimes with cucumbers, they're monoecious. Other times they're andromonoecious, which means there's a lot, they'll have a lot easier time pollinating themselves because they can literally self-pollinate with a perfect flower. But then they're also very hard to hand pollinate because of that reason too. So you really have to know your cucumber or your melon to be able to do this effectively. It's not to discourage you from doing it, but it's not quite as easy as squash. Squash flowers are big and straightforward and wonderful. There are also, you may see in seed catalogs, gynoecious flowers as well, which these are specifically within commercial production for people who are doing like greenhouse cucumbers that need a higher rate of pollination. Those are ones that just have male flowers and don't actually have, to my understanding, any females or very, very few female flowers in there. So this is just a way to enhance the overall pollen load in areas where pollination may be scant. Just like our friends the squash, they are insect pollinated. Isolation distance is similar. We didn't do the full mile because there are so many flowers on cucumbers and melons that in my experience, the cross is rarer. And then also in the case of being andromonoecious, they have a better chance at pollinating themselves. So we recommend still a sizable isolation distance, but not quite as dramatic as squash. And again, it's based on what you have and what you need and how much you care about it crossing. Because if you're growing a green cucumber that's an English slicer and you're in a community garden and your neighbor's growing a green slicing cucumber and it's similar enough, who cares? It's not like you have to disentangle stuff in future years because now your beloved cucumbers turned orange or something like that. Similar to squash, 1+ for viable seed, but that's in emergency situations, the more the merrier. So grow as many as you can, or employ one of the numerous methods that we've discussed, sharing with neighbors, using older seed to recombine in future years along with your new seed, and so on and so forth. This is what a cucumber looks like when it's ripe. They're not always brown. But again, just like with summer squash, just like with eggplant, the eating stage is not the botanically mature stage. Because if you were to bite into a fresh cucumber and be chewing on hard seeds, you would be so excited about that. Some cucumbers actually, I'm thinking of Punakira is one in particular, and even some of the like lemon cucumbers and others, they can get pretty sizable and still be sweet. And some of them are sweeter as a result. But the flesh gets harder, the skin gets tougher, and they're not still on their way to being botanically mature until they look like this. They're really cracked. They're usually like a kind of mauve yellow or orange, or in this case, brown. The browner, the better. Most of the cucumbers that we've saved eventually kind of look like this. This is a mature cucumber. And like we've talked about before, if there's frost or predation or some other need, and you're most of the way there, you can bring that cucumber inside and even attach a little piece of vine for some extra energy and leave that in a sunny window, and they'll continue to ripen somewhat, and you may get some viable seeds. So it doesn't have to be this dramatic, but the riper, the better. So leave them on as long as you can before critters eat them or disease takes them in. So what is a wet seed? And what is a wet seed specifically in the case of cucumbers? Well, just like we talked about with tomatoes, cucumbers are another one that benefits tremendously from fermentation. So because there's not quite as much moisture inside a cucumber as there is inside a tomato, we scoop out the pulp where all the seed cavity is, especially concentrated around the middle. You don't have to get all the flesh and the skin and everything like that unless you're doing a lot of them and you want to just sort of crush and go. But it's important to smash it around as much as you can to break up those little chunks, because that will both encourage the expediting of the fermentation process, and it will be easier to clean and handle when it's all fermented. In a lot of cases with cucumbers, we didn't recommend this with tomatoes. If you feel like there's a lot of mash in there, but the pulp itself kind of looks like mashed potatoes and it's not there's not a lot of moisture in there, you can add a little bit of water, not too much, but just enough that sort of the moisture in there looks like it's filled the vessel right to the line of where your pulp is without being kind of drowning in it. And then you let that sit with a cloth on top of your vessel. So whether, for those who weren't here previously with tomatoes, this can be a glass jar, a mason jar, it can be a crock, it can be a bowl, it can be a bucket if you're doing a lot of them. We recommend putting some sort of rag or cloth on the top just to discourage fruit flies, other critters from going in there, discourage lots of dust unnecessarily forming in there, depending on where it's at. And you let that mash just sit there and stink up your entire house. It's going to get really gross smelling. There's going to be a layer of mold on the top. And when you see that layer of mold form and it's getting really stinky in there, you know that it's active, and you know that that gelatinous sac around the viable seed is breaking down. And it's both allowing for better germination and preventing or inhibiting a lot of seed-borne diseases that might be carried in there, which is usually not a problem if you're bringing in clean fruit from clean plants. So just a little extra icing on the cake there. So again, like with tomatoes, you just mix this mash around, mold and all, or you can scoop the mold out depending on your tolerance threshold, and take one of the seeds out and feel it. And if it feels sort of fuzzy and dry to the touch and it's not squishing right out of your hands like a slimy grape or something like that, then you know that it's ripe. And excuse me, then you know it's done. The fermentation has done its magic. It's broken that seed coat down, that gelatinous coating down, and the seed is ready to be rinsed. But before you rinse it, we have to decant. So just a refresher on this. When you're choosing your vessel, make sure there's plenty of extra space in it. And you're going to fill up your vessel with as much water as you can handle till it gets close to the top. Mix it all around thoroughly, and you'll watch all that viable seed just drop to the bottom of the mix. And the other stuff will just be floating around in space, suspended in the liquid. And then you start gently pouring your vessel off, pouring it off, pouring it off. The pulp is going to fall out, other little bits of debris, non-viable seed will be falling out, and just keep pouring it until you see your moisture level approaching that layer of viable seed on the bottom, and stop. Fill it up with water again. Let the seed settle about 30 seconds to a minute. Same thing, just keep pouring it off until all that pulp is gone and you have beautiful clean seed. Then you can pour that into a strainer or a colander, give it a nice good rinse, and leave it out to dry. So let's move on to melons. This is a wacky looking melon from our friend Nate at Experimental Farm Network from Uzbekistan. So melons come in all shapes and sizes. There are all types of melons. You know, there are cantaloupes and musk melons and canary melons, and they're just all these different types of melons, but all of them except for watermelon and bitter melon are the same genus and species. They're all Cucumis mellow. So they're all cross-compatible. If you grow a Charente next to a honeydew, they're going to cross. If you grow a more esoteric melon like this, except in some very rare instances where things are eaten fresh that are similar looking to a melon but aren't actually a melon, they're all the same genus and species. So best thing to do is to grow one type of melon, unless you want a wonderful mix of melons that just kind of continue to intercross and produce something new. In our experience, it's more likely with melons that they'll be andromonoecious, which means the pollination rates are higher with one plant. So you can usually get away with a few less plants if you are constrained with space with melons, and still get really viable melons for years to come. Similar isolation distance to the cucumber, same reason, same population size. Again, do what works for you, but anytime you can err on the larger side, you're doing biodiversity and posterity a favor. Here are a couple pictures we wanted to illustrate. Aside from these wonderful tendrils that are just reaching around and grabbing things, these are a couple pictures of what an andromonoecious flower looks like. So you can see on the top right especially, there is a bump there. You can't see inside that flower, but the flower below is one of the same. And so that's an example of a perfect flower on a melon. The other one on the top left, I think, looks like it was an aborted flower. You can see how that that bump, that ovary is yellowed and the flower is already kind of falling off. So that's one that did not receive its own pollen and is just sort of aborting, putting its energy elsewhere. Harvesting melons, depending on the variety, can be a tricky task. There are all sorts of designations. And again, the designations don't mean, well, they mean more here than they do in types of melon, because modern types of melons are a cross of Charente and honeydew and cantaloupe and so forth. But when it comes to harvesting, there are a couple of designations that are very helpful to determine when the ripeness is if you don't know the variety that you're working with. So full slip is a melon that does just that. When it is mature, it's ripe, it's ready to go. You can walk by and just give that melon a little push, and it will gently roll right off the vine and break free without much effort whatsoever. Half slips would be something that's somewhere in between with a little coercion, but not actual ripping. They come off, but they can stay on longer. So it can be a little deceiving if you're waiting for it to roll off like a full slip would, and it's not doing its thing. So again, know your varieties. And then there are melons that notoriously do not slip at all. And it's really a matter of watching the colors change slightly. I'm thinking specifically of a Charente, which is a wonderful melon to eat, but it's a very tricky one to tell when the botanical maturity is. It's a lot like an avocado. You're waiting and it's like, not ready, not ready, not ready, ready, too late. So basically there's a very narrow window between when it's botanically mature and it's good eating and when it starts to crack open and rot. So just know the melon that you're getting into and know when it's fully mature, but it's almost always reflected in some sort of color change, whether it's a color along the ribs or the entire melon itself is changing. So recommend, if you're going to do some melon seed saving, it's not hard at all to do, but start with a variety that you know well and know how to harvest at the right time. So processing and storing, scoop seeds separated from the pulp. I have not found there is a benefit to ferment seeds. I think it's largely unnecessary. And because the gelatinous coating around a melon seed is nothing like it is in a cucumber or tomato, there's a higher instance of those fermenting for too long and kind of cutting into the viability of the melon itself. So for that reason, we don't recommend fermenting melons. But if you have a melon variety that has more of a gelatinous feel to the seeds, then by all means, you can try fermenting it. Otherwise, you can just scoop this out, separate the seeds from the pulp. You can see that those sort of cream-colored strips there that the seeds are attached to, they're part of the seed cavity. You just want to pull the seeds off of that. And the really ripe seeds will let go right away. So if you have like clusters of small kind of skinny seeds or hollow seeds like we were talking about with cucumbers that aren't letting go of that pulpy mass, leave them on because they're probably not worth bothering with anyway. Give them a good rinse. If they still feel a little soft or squishy to the touch, you could give them a second rinse after that until they feel better. But generally, just giving them a rinse and setting them out to dry can ensure a high germination rate. So, watermelons, Citrullus lanatus. They do not cross with muskmelons. They are a completely different genus and species. You can grow muskmelons or any type of melon that's not a watermelon, and you can grow a watermelon, and you will have wonderful seed from both if you do your job well. It's another one of those sort of squishy, wet, dry seeds. Technically speaking, the seed type is a wet seed because it does have inhibitors to prevent it from sprouting, but we treat it as though we treat a dry seed. We'll get into that in just a second. There's not fermentation required for this at all, like there is for cucumbers. Similar to the cucumbers and melons, though, I found this to be even rarer in watermelons in my own experience. They're usually monoecious, so similar to squash, but some can tend towards being andromonoecious and have some self-perfect flowers on there where the ovaries are located. Which is why we wrote mixture of self and cross-pollination. Usually just rely on the insects. It's almost always about the insects with watermelons. Similar isolation distance, population size. We're just kind of staying straight with that for the cucurbits. The magic test of harvesting a ripe watermelon. So what you see in the picture here, this is a blacktail watermelon, blacktail mountain, excuse me, developed by Glenn Drowns, a wonderful seed saver at Sand Hill Preservation for northern climates. And you can see here one of the three indicators of a ripe watermelon, which is there is a blushed yellow spot. This is usually what's on the ground. So if you turn your watermelon over, you see this blush. That's one indicator that ripeness is happening in there. If it's very, very faint or you don't see a blush yet, sometimes there are ripe watermelons, depending on the variety and depending on the season and time of season, that can still mature without this kind of blush here. But that nice yellow blush on most watermelons is a clear indicator that maturity is happening. So that's one of the threefold ripeness tests. The second, which I don't have a great picture of, unfortunately, but if you look closely at this one, you can see that there, and if you've grown watermelon, you know this, there are all these kind of wispy tendrils that are coming off the stem. The tendril that is closest to the stem of your watermelon, the one that's immediately above. So if you're holding your watermelon and you're looking at the stem that attaches it to the plant, right above that, there will be two little tendrils right before the stem connects to the plant itself. Those tendrils will be brown or yellow. They'll be withered and dead. That's a sign that the plant is no longer sending energy towards that melon. So hopefully that means it's ripe. Sometimes it can be because of stress or other conditions or other priorities for the plant. But generally speaking, you want to see that tendril just wither and desiccate or fall off, or just be dried out on the plant, not necessarily fall off. And then there's the ever elusive knock test. An unripe melon has a firmer flesh on the inside. Its moisture content hasn't developed in the same way. When you knock on that melon, and there is obviously nuance to this, but you'll hear a plinking sound. It'll be really tight, like a plink, 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 like that flesh is really hard and secure and doesn't want to let go. A ripe watermelon will not make a plink, but will make a ploink. More like a thud. If you think of somebody hitting like timpani or a bass drum, and there's a little resonance there, like a boom, boom, boom. Maybe timpani's too dramatic. Let's say a muted bass drum, something like that. You hear a sort of resonation on the inside that sounds a little more like it's hollow than it's tight. Other than that, you just have to try and experiment. But there's obviously nothing more discouraging than waiting for that beautiful watermelon to ripen and then cutting into it only to have it be water with a rind. So if you do these three things together, you're likely to determine ripeness as more of a surefire thing than if you're doing just one in isolation. But again, know your variety, because some varieties can ploink so much that they're actually mush on the inside by the time you cut into them. Experiment and have fun. Our favorite way to process watermelon is to invite friends and family over. This was obviously very taboo during COVID, but you can do it outside. Have a spitting party. Forget these silly seedless watermelons. They're a waste of time. They're a commercial development. There are some seed catalogs for commercial growers that will list specific triploid watermelons that are designed to be seedless. There's some botany in here that I don't have time to get into, and I'm largely above my pay grade to explain, and I would have Hannah do. But for the interest of time, just avoid those triploids altogether. Get a seeded watermelon, because they're going to taste better, and you're going to have a lot of fun spitting those seeds, especially if kids are around, into a big vessel, and then rinsing them somewhere safe and responsible, and just dry them out on a plate after they get a good rinse. It's as easy as that. If you're just doing it for seed saving, and I'm looking at this slide now and I'm saying, why would you ever want to just scoop watermelon seeds out and not eat the thing? Because if you've gotten that far and it's botanically mature and you're saving it for flavor, then you're going to want to eat it because it's in front of you and it's wonderful. So forget that scooping seed. Just eat it and spit it. That's the way to do it. No further action needed. Just spit them out, give them a nice healthy rinse, put them on a plate to dry, snap test, and you're done.